I'll bet you can. Then we'll find your wife and 3 kids and make them disappear, too.
Michael Sullivan's brain was reeling through all the permutations and possibilities now. Maybe he could take the one guy out, the loudmouth. Then it wouldn't be a total loss anyway. Shut his ugly hole once and for all. Cut him bad, too. But what about the other 3? Maybe he could get 2 of them, if he was good and lucky. If he could get them close enough to use his blade, which wouldn't happen. They were probably stupid, but not that stupid. So how could he make something happen? He didn't want to go down without a fight.
You man enough to take me out yourself? He called to the big mouth. Hey, Babbo?
He used the mob term for idiot, for some useless underling. He was trying to get under his skin if he could. Hell, he'd try anything right now. He was going to die in the next minute or so, and he just wasn't ready to go yet. The killer's mouth twisted into a grim smile.
No doubt about it. I could take you out myself. But guess what? Guess who's the Babbo today? Give you a hint. You probably wiped his ass this morning.
The butcher reached into the pocket of his sweatshirt, and he kept his hand there. The big-mouthed hood immediately had second thoughts and put his free hand up. The others stopped walking. They all had their guns out, but they weren't coming any closer to the legendary butcher. The big talker gestured for the men behind Sullivan to move to the right, while he and the 4th man moved left. That gave everybody a clear line of fire. Smart thinking.
You stupid Mick messed up this time, didn't you? Question for you. You ever think it'd end like this?
Sullivan had to laugh at that one.
You know what? I never thought it would end. Never occurred to me.
Still hasn't, actually.
Oh, it's gonna end all right. Right here. Right now. Just keep watching the movie until the house lights go out for you.
Which was obviously the truth. No doubt about it. But then the butcher heard something that was hard for him to believe. It came from behind, so he had to turn around to check it out, to see if it was real or some cruel joke being played on him. Somebody was shouting at the far end of the alley. This had to be some kind of seriously messed up miracle. Or it was the luckiest day of his life. Maybe both. The cavalry had arrived. Look who was here to save the day.
Chapter 87.
DC Police, everybody put the guns down. Do it now. We're police officers. Guns down on the ground.
Sullivan saw the cops, and they looked like detectives, 2 buff-looking black guys in street clothes. They were coming up behind the Mafia hoods who were standing near 31st Street and trying to figure out what the hell to do next, their next move. So was he. What a sight the 2 cops were, though, and Sullivan wondered, could they be part of the task force put into Georgetown to catch the rapist? To catch him? Hell, he'd bet a bundle that's what they were. And if it was true, he was the only one in the alleyway who had figured it out so far. One of the cops was already calling in for help. Then the 2 mob guys near Wisconsin just turned around, and they walked away. The detectives had their guns out, but what were they going to do? Realistically, what could they do? Sullivan almost began to laugh as he turned slowly and walked toward Wisconsin, too. Then he began to run, a full-out sprint toward the busy street. Madman that he was, he started laughing his ass off. He'd decided to brazen it out, just run, like in the old days back in Brooklyn when he was a kid making his bones in the game.
Run, Mikey, run! Run for your life!
What could the D.C. Metro cops do? Shoot him in the back? For what? Running? Being the potential victim of 4 armed men in an alleyway? The cops were yelling, threatening him. But all they could do was watch him get away. Funniest thing he'd seen in years. Maybe ever. The cavalry had come to the rescue. His huge mistake. Theirs.
Chapter 88. Half a dozen uniforms were moving in and out of the station house on Wisconsin when Sampson and I got there that afternoon. A detective named Michael Wright had finally made the connection that he and his partner might have just missed capturing the Georgetown rapist, that he'd maybe missed the biggest deal of his career. Still, they were holding two men in the cage who might know what was going on. They needed a closer. Sampson and I passed inside a 10-foot-high bulletproof partition and headed for the interrogation rooms, which were beyond the detective's cubicle area. The workspace looked familiar. Scarred, badly littered desks, old computers and phones from another era, overhead storage bins filled to overflowing. Before we entered the interrogation room, Wright told us that the two men in there hadn't said a word so far, but they'd been armed with Berettas, and he was sure they were killers. "Have fun," Wright said. Then John and I walked inside. Sampson spoke up first. "I'm Detective John Sampson. This is Dr. Alex Cross. Dr. Cross is a forensic psychologist involved in the investigation of a series of rapes in the Georgetown area. I'm a detective on the case." Neither of the men said a word, not even a wisecrack to break the ice. Both of them looked to be in their early 30s, bodybuilder types with permanent smirks on their faces. Sampson asked a couple more questions, then we just sat there in silence across the table from the two men. Eventually, an administrative assistant knocked on the door and entered. She handed Sampson a couple of faxes, hot from the machine. He read the pages, then handed them to me. "I didn't think the Mafia was active in the D.C. area," Sampson said. "Guess I was wrong. You're both soldiers in the mob. Either of you have anything to say about what was going down in that alley?" They didn't, and they were annoyingly smug about not answering our questions and pretending we weren't even there. "Dr. Cross, maybe we can work this out without their help. What do you think?" Sampson asked me. "We can try. It says here that John Digger Antonelli and Joseph Blade Lanigello work for John Maggione out of New York City. That would be John Maggione, Jr. Maggione Sr. was the one who hired a man named Michael Sullivan, also known as the Butcher, to do a hit in D.C. several years back. You remember that one, John?" "I do. Took out a Chinese drug dealer. Your wife, Maria, was also murdered right around that time. Mr. Sullivan is now a suspect in this case. The same Michael the Butcher Sullivan is also a suspect in a series of rapes in Georgetown, and at least one murder connected to the rapes. Was Sullivan the man you had cornered in Blues Alley?" I asked the Mafia hitters. Not a word came from either of them. Nothing at all. Real tough guys. Sampson finally stood up, rubbing his chin. "So I guess we don't need Digger and Blade anymore. Well, what should we do with them?" "Wait, I have an idea. You'll like this one, Alex," Sampson said, and chuckled to himself. He motioned for the Mafia soldiers to get up. "We're finished here. You can come with me, gentlemen." "Where?" Lanigello finally broke his silence. "You ain't charged us yet." "Let's go. Got a surprise for you." Sampson walked in front of the two of them, and I walked behind. They didn't seem to like having me at the rear. Maybe they thought I might still be harboring a grudge about what had happened to Maria. Well, maybe I was. Sampson signaled a guard at the end of the hall, and he used his keys to open a cell door. The holding area was already filled with several prisoners awaiting arraignment. All but one of them was black. John led the way inside. "You'll be staying here. If you change your mind and want to talk to us," Sampson said to the Mafia guys, "give a holler. That is, if Dr. Cross and I are still in the building. If not, we'll check in on you in the morning. If that's the case, have a nice night." Sampson tapped his shield a few times against the bars of the holding pen. "These two men are suspects in a series of rapes," he announced to the other prisoners. "Rapes of black women in Southeast. Be careful, though. These are tough guys. From New York." We left, and the lockup guard slammed the cell door behind us. Chapter 89.
4 o'clock on a cold, rainy morning, and his two younger boys were crying their eyes out in the back seat of the car. So was Caitlin up in front. Sullivan blamed Junior Maggione and La Cosa Nostra for everything, the huge, ugly mess that was happening now. Somehow, Magione was going to pay for this, and he looked forward to the day of retribution. So did his scalpel and his butcher's saw. At 2:30 in the morning, he had piled his family into the car and snuck away from a house 6 miles outside Wheeling, West Virginia. It was their second move in as many weeks, but he had no choice in the matter. He'd promised the boys they would return to Maryland one day, but he knew that wasn't true. They wouldn't ever go back to Maryland. Sullivan already had an offer on the house there. He needed the cash for their escape plan. So now, he and the family were running for their lives. As they left their wild West Virginia home, as he called it, he had a feeling that the mob would find them again, that they could be right around the next bend in the road. But he rounded the next curve, and the curve after that, and made it out of town safe and sound and in one piece. Soon they were singing Rolling Stones and ZZ Top tunes, including about a 20-minute version of Legs, until his wife put her foot down about the non-stop high testosterone noise. They stopped at Denny's for breakfast, at Mickey D's for a second bathroom break, and by 3 in the afternoon they were somewhere they had never been before. Hopefully, Sullivan had left no trail to be followed by a crew of mob killers. No breadcrumbs like in Hansel and Gretel. The good thing was, neither he nor his family had ever been in this area before. It was virgin territory, with no roots or connections. He pulled into the driveway of a shingle-style Victorian house with a steep roof, a couple of turrets, even a stained-glass window.
"I love this house,"
Sullivan crowed, and he was all fake smiles and hyper-enthusiasm.
"Welcome to Florida, kiddos,"
he said.
"Very funny, Dad." "Not,"
said Mike Jr. from the back seat, where all 3 boys were looking grim and depressed. They were in Florida, Massachusetts, and Caitlin and the kids groaned at another of his dumb jokes. Florida was a small community of less than 1,000 situated high in the Berkshires. It had stunning mountain views, if nothing else, and there were no mafia hitmen waiting in the driveway. What more could they ask for?
"Just perfect. What could be better than this?"
Sullivan kept telling the kids as they started to unpack again. So why was Caitlin crying as he showed her their new living room with the sweeping views of Big Bad Mount Greylock and the Hoosick River? Why was he lying to her when he said, "Everything is going to be all right, my queen, light of my life"? Maybe because he knew it wasn't true, and probably so did she. He and his family were going to be murdered one day, maybe in this very house. Unless he did something dramatic to stop it, and fast. But what could that be? How could he stop the mafia from coming after him? How could you kill the mob?
Chapter 90.
2 nights later, the butcher was on the move again. Just him. One man. He had a plan now and was traveling south to New York City. He was uptight and nervous, but singing along with Springsteen, Dylan, the band, Pink Floyd. Nothing but oldies and greaties for the 4-hour ride south. He didn't particularly want to leave Caitlin and the boys at the house in Massachusetts, but he figured they'd probably be safe there for now. If not, he had done the best he could for them. Better than his father ever did for him, or for his mother and brothers. He finally pulled off the West Side Highway at around midnight. Then he went straight away to the Morningside Apartments on West 107th. He'd stayed there before and knew it was just out of the way enough to suit his purposes. Convenient, too, with 4 different subway lines going through the 2 nearby stations. No air conditioning in the rooms, he remembered, but that didn't matter in November. He slept like a baby safe in a mother's womb. When Sullivan woke at 7, covered in a light sheen of his own sweat, his mind was focused on a single idea: payback against Junior Magione. Or maybe an even better idea: survival of the fittest and the toughest. Around 9 that morning, he took a subway ride to check out a couple of possible locations for murders he wanted to commit in the near future. He had a wish list with several different targets, and wondered if any of these men and two women had an idea that they were